Apologize to her, right now. Daniel's voice cut through the room like it belonged there more than I did, calm and certain, like he wasn't asking but correcting a mistake. His girlfriend didn't even look at me, just lifted her glass of red wine and smiled, like this was already decided. I felt every pair of eyes at the table shift toward me, waiting, measuring. "You embarrassed her," Daniel added, leaning back in his chair like a judge settling in for a verdict. "Fix it." The words didn't hit all at once. They landed slowly, like something sinking through water, heavy and quiet, until I realized what he was actually asking. Not asking, demanding, in front of his entire family, on Christmas Eve. If this story speaks to you, only if it truly resonates with you, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from along with your local time. I read every comment, and it reminds me I wasn't as alone as I thought. My name is Sophia Bennett. I'm 32 years old, and this was the night my marriage ended without anyone else realizing it yet. It started hours earlier, in a house that never felt like mine, even after 3 years of trying to belong. The Bennett family home sat just outside Boston, a 3-story colonial with white pillars and a driveway that curved like it was designed to impress people before they even stepped inside. I parked my car at the far end, like I always did, even though there was space closer. Old habits. Don't take up too much room. Don't assume you belong. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothed the front of my navy dress, and told myself the same thing I told myself every year. Just get through dinner. Smile when you need to. Stay quiet when it matters. It's just a few hours. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and roasted turkey. Laughter echoed from the dining room, the kind that felt full but somehow didn't make space for me. Daniel was already there, standing near the fireplace, one hand in his pocket, the other resting lightly on the back of a woman I had never seen before. She was laughing at something, he said, her head tilted just enough to show she was used to being looked at. I stopped in the doorway for half a second too long. "Sophia?" Daniel said when he noticed me, like he had just remembered I was part of the evening. His hand didn't move from her back. "You're late." I glanced at the clock on the wall. 6:58 p.m. Dinner was at 7. "Traffic," I said quietly, setting my purse down by the entry table. His mother, Eleanor Bennett, appeared almost immediately, her smile thin and practiced. "We like to be early for family events," she said, her eyes scanning my outfit, my hair, everything. "It shows respect." "Of course," I replied, nodding slightly like I always did. Then she turned, already losing interest, and gestured toward the woman beside Daniel. "This is Lila," she said. "She works with Daniel. Works with him." The words felt rehearsed. Lila extended her hand, her smile warm in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "I've heard so much about you," she said. I took her hand. "I haven't heard anything about you," I answered, before I could stop myself. There was a pause, small, sharp. Daniel's jaw tightened for just a second, but then he laughed, smooth and dismissive. "Sophia's just tired," he said to Lila. "Long day doing, what is it you do again?" The room chuckled softly. Not loud, not cruel, just enough. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I kept my face still. "Operations," I said. "Right," Daniel nodded, like it was something forgettable. "Support stuff." Dinner was called, and we all moved to the table. 12 seats. I noticed mine had been shifted slightly, placed farther down than usual. A small thing, easy to miss, but I noticed. I always noticed. Plates were passed. Wine was poured. Conversations flowed around me like I was sitting behind glass. Daniel spoke easily, confidently, telling stories about work, about deals, about big moves coming in the new year. Lila leaned in when he talked, her hand brushing his arm like it was already familiar. No one stopped her. No one looked at me. Halfway through dinner, Eleanor set down her fork and looked directly at me. "Sophia," she said, her tone light but precise. There was a bit of an awkward moment earlier. I met her gaze. "I'm sorry?" "With Lila," she continued. "Your comment at the door, it was unnecessary." I felt Daniel shift beside me, his chair scraping lightly against the floor. "Yeah," he added, his voice lower now, controlled. "You embarrassed her." Lila gave a small, almost embarrassed smile, like she didn't want to be the center of attention but wasn't going to step away from it either. "It's really fine," she said softly. "But it wasn't fine, it was never fine. You need to apologize." Daniel said, turning fully toward me now. Right now. The room went quiet. Forks paused. Glasses hovered midair. I could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights, the ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall. Daniel, I said carefully, we can talk about this later. No, he replied immediately. We're talking about it now. He leaned closer, just enough that only I could hear the next part. Or you can forget your paycheck this month. And the bonus. Your choice. My stomach tightened. Not from fear, from clarity. Because in that moment, something finally made sense. Not just tonight, not just Lila. Everything. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't try to soften what I saw. I didn't try to make it smaller. Around us, his family waited, calm, comfortable. Like this was normal. Like I was the one out of place. I reached for my glass, set it down carefully, and folded my hands in my lap. Okay, I said. My voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It just settled. Daniel leaned back slightly, satisfied, like he'd restored order. Lila smiled again, softer this time. They thought this was the end of something small. A moment. A correction. They didn't know it was the beginning of something else entirely. Because what none of them realized, sitting there under the warm lights with their polished plates and perfect expectations, was that I had already made a decision long before this dinner started. And the truth was, they had no idea who I actually was or what I had already set in motion before I ever walked through that door. The word okay sat in my chest long after I said it, like something that had been waiting for years to finally come out. And while the conversation at the table slowly picked back up around me, I barely heard any of it because my mind had already moved somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere older. Back to the first time I learned exactly how to stay still when I was being pushed aside, because this was not new, it just felt bigger now, sharper, harder to ignore, but the pattern was the same. It always had been, and it did not start with Daniel. It started long before I ever met him, in a house 2 states away where everything looked normal from the outside and nothing ever felt balanced inside. I was 8 years old the first time. I noticed it clearly. Standing in the kitchen with a paper certificate in my hand, edges slightly bent from the bus ride home. I had won a regional math competition. Nothing huge, just a small district event, but it mattered to me. I remember walking in and placing it carefully on the counter where my mother was cutting vegetables, waiting for her to look at it. She glanced once, nodded, and said, "That is nice, Sophia, but do not leave it there. It will get dirty." And that was it. No smile, no questions, just a quiet dismissal. A moment that ended before it even began. Later that same evening, my younger brother came home with a participation ribbon from a local baseball game. Nothing special, just something handed out to every kid, and my father clapped him on the back like he had just won a championship. "That is my boy," he said loudly, pulling the ribbon up for everyone to see. My mother laughed, actually laughed, and asked him to tell the story of the game 3 times. I stood there holding my certificate, watching the difference, feeling it settle somewhere inside me without fully understanding it yet, and that was how it always went. Small things, repeated enough times that they stopped feeling like accidents and started feeling like rules. Rules I was expected to follow without ever being told, do not expect too much, do not take up space, do not make things uncomfortable. When I was 12, I asked my father if he could come to a school presentation. I had been preparing for weeks. It was on international markets, something I had chosen because I liked understanding how things connected across countries. He barely looked up from his phone and said, "We will see, kiddo," which I learned later meant no. That same weekend, he drove 3 hours to attend one of my brother's tournaments. Even though it rained the entire time, I remember standing on stage during my presentation, scanning the audience for a familiar face that never showed up. My teacher smiled at me afterward and said, "You explained that better than most college students," and I thanked her, but what I really wanted was for someone at home to notice, to ask, to care, but they never did. Not really. And over time I stopped expecting them to. I adjusted, quietly, carefully, the way you do when you realize the system is not going to change for you, so you learn to work around it. I became the one who did not need attention, the one who handled things, the one who supported. It was easier that way. Less friction, Less disappointment. When I was 16, my mother once told me, "You are the steady one, Sophia. We do not worry about you." And she meant it as a compliment, but it landed like a definition, something that explained why I was always the second thought, the background, the safe choice that did not require effort. And I carried that with me into everything that came after, including my marriage, including Daniel. The first time I met him, he noticed me in a way that felt different, intentional, like I was not invisible. We were both in our late 20s. At a networking event in downtown Chicago, I had just finished presenting a small operations project for a mid-sized firm. Nothing flashy, but solid, detailed, the kind of work that keeps systems from falling apart. Daniel approached me afterward. Confident, easy smile. "You explained that better than the actual director," he said. And I remember laughing, surprised. "That is because I did most of the work," I replied. And he liked that answer, or at least I thought he did. We started talking, then dating, and for a while it felt balanced, like I had finally stepped into a space where I was seen, where my work mattered, where I mattered. But looking back now, I can see the shift, slow, almost invisible at first. The way he would interrupt me in conversations and finish my sentences, the way he introduced me to people as Sophia, she helps with operations, reducing years of experience into something smaller, something easier to overlook. The way his family adopted that version of me without question, reinforcing it every time we sat at that long dining table, every time I was asked to help set up instead of join discussions, every time my input was acknowledged with a polite nod and then ignored. It was familiar. Too familiar. And that was the problem, because I knew how to survive in that environment. I had been doing it my whole life. I knew how to stay quiet, how to make things easier for everyone else, how to keep the peace. But what none of them ever understood, not my parents, not Daniel, not anyone sitting at that table that night, was that staying quiet did not mean I had nothing to say. It just meant I was choosing the moment, and that moment, the one I had been preparing for without even realizing it at first, had already started long before Christmas Eve, long before Lila walked into that room, long before Daniel leaned in and told me to apologize like I owed them something. Because weeks earlier, in a conference room overlooking a skyline that was not Boston, I had been asked a question that changed everything, and I had already answered it in a way none of them could take back. I remember exactly how the room smelled that morning. Faint coffee, cold air from the vent, and something sharp like new carpet, the kind that tells you this place matters more than the people inside it. I was standing on the 32nd floor of a glass building in downtown Chicago, looking out at a skyline that stretched farther than anything I had ever allowed myself to imagine being part of. And for the first time in a long time, I was not waiting to be noticed. I had already been invited. "Miss Bennett," the woman across the table said, sliding a folder toward me, her tone precise, measured. "We have reviewed your work on the restructuring project in Boston." I kept my hands still, resting lightly on the table. But inside, something shifted, quiet but undeniable, because that project was never supposed to be visible, not to anyone outside the company. "Your analysis identified inefficiencies that our own senior team missed," she continued. And I noticed the way the other two executives exchanged a glance, not skeptical, not dismissive, but interested, which was new, unfamiliar. "We are opening a new operations division in London," she said, and that word London landed differently than anything else had that day, heavier, bigger. "We need someone who can build systems from the ground up, someone who understands both the structure and the pressure points." I nodded once, slowly, giving myself time to process, not because I did not understand what she was offering, but because I understood it too well. "And you think that is me?" I said, my voice steady even, the way I had learned to keep it. She did not hesitate. "We know it is you," she replied, and that certainty, direct and unfiltered, felt unfamiliar in a way that made it hard to respond immediately. I opened the folder, scanning the documents. The offer was detailed, specific, relocation package, leadership authority, direct reporting line that bypassed several layers of management. Everything about it said this was not a suggestion. It was a decision waiting for my answer. This would require a transition within 30 days, one of the executives added, and full discretion until the announcement. I closed the folder carefully, aligning the edges with the table, a small habit, something I did when I needed to think. "I would need to review the terms," I said, because that was the expected response, even though a part of me had already decided, "Of course." She nodded, then paused, studying me in a way that felt deliberate. "Can I ask you something, Sophia?" I met her gaze. "Why are you still in a support role?" The question was simple, but it carried weight, not judgment, not criticism, just curiosity. I held her gaze for a second longer than usual, then answered honestly, "Because it is where I was placed." She tilted her head slightly. "And you stayed?" I did not answer that, because the truth was not something I had fully said out loud before. Even to myself, I had stayed because it was familiar, because I knew how to exist there without conflict, because it was easier to be underestimated than to fight for space. But sitting there, looking at that skyline, holding an offer that did not see me as secondary or optional, I realized something I had been avoiding for years. Staying was also a choice, and for the first time, I was not sure it was one I wanted to keep making. "We will need your answer soon," she said, sliding a pen across the table, not pushing, not insisting, just placing the option within reach. I did not pick it up right away. Instead, I asked the one question that mattered most. "If I accept this," I said, "what happens to my current position?" There was a brief pause, then a small, almost knowing smile. "It will be filled," she replied quickly. I nodded. That made sense, it always did. People adapt, systems replace. That was the nature of the work I did. I closed the folder, my hand resting on top of it for a second, grounding myself. Then I said it. Simple, direct, "I accept." The pen felt heavier than it should have as I signed my name. Not because of doubt, but because I understood exactly what this meant. Not just professionally, but personally. This was not just a promotion, it was a shift, a break in a pattern that had defined most of my life. And once it started, it would not be easy to reverse. "Welcome aboard, Sophia," she said, extending her hand. I shook it, firm, steady, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something that was not quiet, not contained, but clear. I left the building with the signed documents in my bag, the winter air sharp against my face. My phone buzzed almost immediately. Daniel, his name flashing across the screen. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone even. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice distracted, like he was already thinking about something else. "Work," I replied. "Late meeting." There was a pause, then he said, "Do not forget dinner with my parents this weekend," like it was the only thing that mattered. I looked out at the street, people moving quickly, purposefully, each one going somewhere that mattered to them. "I will be there," I said, because at that moment, I still believed I could manage both worlds, still believed I could step into something bigger without disrupting everything else. But as I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my coat pocket, I knew something had already started to change, something I could not fully explain yet. And what I did not know then, standing on that sidewalk with the city moving around me, was that by the time that dinner came, by the time I walked into that house again, someone else would already be sitting in my place, and they would be smiling like they had always belonged there. The shift did not happen all at once. It never does. It came in small pieces, quiet adjustments that felt harmless at first, easy to ignore if you were not paying attention, and for a while, I told myself it was nothing, just timing, just stress, just the way things sometimes move when people get busy. But looking back now, I can see exactly where it started to turn. The first real crack came 3 days after I signed the papers. I was back in the office, reviewing a set of reports when my email notification blinked. A meeting invite, subject line, operations transition discussion. I frowned slightly, because I had not requested any transition. Not yet, not publicly. I opened it. The meeting was scheduled for that afternoon, hosted by Daniel. Attendees included several senior managers, and one name I did not recognize at the time, Lila Grant. I stared at the screen for a second, longer than necessary. Something about it felt off. Not wrong enough to act on, but not right either. I clicked accept, then closed the window, telling myself I would understand more once I was in the room. But when I walked into that conference room at 2 p.m., I knew immediately that something had already been decided without me. Daniel was standing at the head of the table, relaxed, confident, like he was presenting something he owned. Lila sat 2 seats to his right, laptop open, posture straight, Her expression composed in a way that looked practiced. The moment I stepped in, the conversation paused just slightly, not enough to call out, but enough to notice. "Sophia," Daniel said, like he was acknowledging someone arriving late to something already in progress, even though I was exactly on time. "Glad you could make it." I took my seat, placing my notebook in front of me, aligning it with the edge of the table, a small habit, grounding. "What is this about?" I asked. Keeping my tone neutral, Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Lila before answering. "We are restructuring some of the operations flow," he said. "Streamlining responsibilities." The word sounded familiar, like something pulled from a template. "And this involves me how?" I asked, already sensing the answer before he said it. Lila leaned forward slightly, her voice smooth, professional. "We have been reviewing your workload," she said, her fingers resting lightly on the keyboard, "and we believe there are areas where we can optimize efficiency." Optimize efficiency? I almost smiled at the phrase. It was one I had used countless times in my own reports. Now it was being used on me. Daniel nodded, reinforcing her point. "You have been stretched thin," he added. "It makes sense to redistribute some of your responsibilities." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the shift clearly for the first time, not just in his words, but in his posture. The way he spoke about my work like it was something he had authority over, something he could adjust, redefine, control. "Which responsibilities?" I asked, my voice still calm, still measured. Lila tapped a key, and a slide appeared on the screen. My projects, broken down into sections, with several marked in a different color. "These," she said, "we believe can be reassigned." I recognized every single one, not just as tasks, but as systems I had built from the ground up, processes that only worked because I understood how they connected, how they adapted under pressure. "Reassigned to who?" I asked. Even though I already knew the answer, Daniel did not hesitate. "Lila will be taking over these areas," he said, and there it was. Simple, direct. As if it had always been the plan. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not panic, not anger, just clarity, sharp and unmistakable. "On what basis?" I asked, turning my attention to Lila. She met my gaze without hesitation. "I have experience in strategic alignment," she said, "and Daniel believes I can bring a fresh perspective. Daniel believes, not the company, not the board, Daniel." I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting lightly on the table. "And my input on this decision," I asked, looking back at him, "was not required." There was a brief pause, just long enough to confirm what I already knew. "We are moving quickly on this," he said. His tone firm now, less collaborative, more directive. "There is no time for delays." The room stayed quiet. The other managers avoided eye contact, their focus fixed on the screen, on their notes. "Anywhere but me." I nodded once, slowly, absorbing it, not reacting the way they expected, not pushing back, not making it uncomfortable, because that was the role they had assigned me, the steady one, the one who adjusted, the one who did not disrupt. "Understood," I said, closing my notebook. The sound of it clicking shut felt louder than it should have. The meeting continued. Details discussed, timelines outlined. Lila spoke with confidence, referencing documents she should not have had access to yet, and systems she had not built but now described as if they were hers. And the more she spoke, the more I realized this was not a spontaneous decision. It had been building, quietly, behind conversations I was not part of, decisions made without my knowledge. My role reduced step by step until this moment felt like a natural conclusion instead of what it really was. A replacement, carefully positioned, fully supported, and believed by everyone in that room. When the meeting ended, people gathered their things quickly. Avoiding unnecessary conversation, Daniel lingered for a moment, watching me as I packed my notebook into my bag. "Do not take it personally," he said, his voice softer now, like he was offering something considerate. "This is just business." I looked at him, holding his gaze just long enough to let the silence settle between us. Then I said, "Of course," because there was nothing else to say, nothing that would change what had already been set in motion. I stood, adjusted my coat, and walked out of the room without looking back. But the moment the door closed behind me, something inside finally gave way, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet collapse of something I had been holding together for far too long, and in that moment, standing alone in the hallway with the distant hum of office noise around me, I understood something that made everything else fall into place. They did not just underestimate me, they had already decided I did not matter, and that was the exact moment everything I had built there stopped being something I was willing to protect. The hallway felt colder than it should have, even though the thermostat on the wall read 72, and I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, my hand still resting on the strap of my bag, as if letting go of it would mean accepting something I had not fully processed yet. But I did let go, eventually, because there was nothing left to hold on to in that building, not in the way there used to be. I walked back to my desk slowly, noticing things I had not paid attention to before, the way people lowered their voices as I passed, the way one of the junior analysts quickly minimized a document when I approached, not because I had done anything wrong, but because something about my position had already shifted in their minds. And that was how it spread, quietly, without announcement, without confrontation, just a collective understanding that I was no longer at the center of anything that mattered. I sat down, turned on my monitor, and opened my email. The screen filled with messages, most of them routine, a few marked urgent, but none of them addressed what had just happened, not directly. Instead, there was a forwarded thread from Lila, subject line, updated workflow alignment. She had sent it to the team, outlining changes that mirrored exactly what had been presented in the meeting, except now the language was even more confident, more final. As discussed with leadership, I will be taking over key operational functions previously handled by Sophia. I read that line twice, not because I did not understand it, but because of how easily it had been accepted, how quickly it had been framed as a decision already agreed upon. I scrolled further. Responses from other team members. Short, supportive, sounds great. Looking forward to the transition. Happy to collaborate. Not one question. Not one hesitation. Just immediate alignment. I closed the thread, my fingers resting lightly on the keyboard, and for a moment, I considered replying, correcting the narrative, clarifying what had actually happened. But I did not, because I knew it would not change anything. The version they had been given was already more convenient than the truth, and convenience tends to win. My phone buzzed on the desk. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I watched it ring once, twice, then I answered. Not because I wanted to, but because ignoring it would raise more questions than I was ready to deal with. What? I said, keeping my voice neutral. He sighed, like he was the one dealing with something difficult. Sophia, do not make this into a bigger issue than it is, he said. We are just trying to improve efficiency. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling for a second before responding. By replacing me, I said, simply. There was a pause. Then he replied, that is not what this is. His tone sharpened slightly. Defensive now. You are still part of the team. I almost laughed at that, but I did not. Which part? I asked. The part where I do the work or the part where someone else takes credit for it, he exhaled. Louder this time. You are overreacting, he said. Lila is just helping. Helping. I repeated the word silently, letting it settle. Of course, I said out loud. She seems very helpful. The silence on the other end stretched for a moment. Then he said, look, we will talk about this tonight, like it was something that could be resolved over dinner, like it was a misunderstanding instead of a decision. No, I said. Before he could continue, we will not. I ended the call before he could respond, my hand steady as I placed the phone back on the desk. A few seconds later, it buzzed again. A message this time. Do not do anything stupid. I read it once, then locked the screen without replying. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of small tasks and quiet observations. Emails continued to come in, some from people asking for access to files they had never needed before, others from departments requesting updates on projects that were no longer technically mine. I responded where necessary. Short, precise answers. No extra information, no explanation, just enough to keep things moving. Around 5 p.m., I received another message, this time from Lila. Can you send me the latest version of the vendor integration model? I stared at the screen. The message was polite, professional, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if she was simply stepping into a role that had been clearly defined and willingly handed over. I typed a response, paused, then deleted it, typed again, which version? I sent, she replied almost immediately. The one you have been using, I read that twice. The one I had been using, not the one the company had documented, not the one in the shared system, the one that existed because I had built it, refined it, adjusted it over time in ways that were never fully written down. I will get back to you, I replied, then closed the message without sending anything else. By the time I left the office, the sky had already darkened, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement from a light rain that had passed earlier. I sat in my car for a few minutes before starting the engine, my phone lighting up again, this time with multiple notifications, missed calls from Daniel, a voicemail, 2 emails. I opened the voicemail first. His voice came through, controlled but tense. Sophia, call me back. We need to fix this. Fix this. I listened to it twice, then deleted it. The emails were longer, more structured. Attempts to reframe the situation. Let us approach this professionally. We value your contributions. There is room for discussion, words arranged carefully to sound reasonable, to suggest that nothing had been taken, only adjusted. I did not reply to any of them. I placed the phone face down on the passenger seat and started the car. The engine hummed quietly as I pulled out of the parking lot, merging into traffic without thinking, the road ahead stretching out in a line of red taillights and white headlights, moving in opposite directions. And for the first time that day, I allowed myself to feel it fully. Not the anger, not the frustration, but the absence, the space where something used to be. Trust, maybe, or expectation, something that had kept me connected to all of this. And now it was gone. Not broken, not taken, just removed. And as I drove through the city, surrounded by thousands of people moving through their own lives, I realized how completely alone I felt in that moment. Not because there was no one around me, but because there was no one left who actually saw me. And that kind of silence is not loud. It does not demand attention. It just settles in, steady and quiet, until you understand that you are the only one still listening. The apartment felt unfamiliar that night. Even though I had lived there for almost 3 years, every object exactly where it had always been, but nothing carrying the same weight anymore. I set my keys down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet, the kind of quiet that does not comfort you, just reminds you that there is no one else there to fill it. My phone buzzed again. I did not need to look to know it was Daniel, but I looked anyway, his name lighting up the screen like it still meant something. I let it ring until it stopped. Then another message came through. Where are you? Followed by, we need to talk. I placed the phone face down and walked into the living room, the lamp in the corner casting a soft light that barely reached the edges of the space. I sat on the couch without turning on anything else. No television, no music, just the low hum of the refrigerator in the other room and the faint sound of cars passing outside. It felt like everything had slowed down, like I was moving through something thicker than time. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time that day, I allowed the thought to settle fully. There was nothing left to fix, not in the way he meant it, not in the way they all expected. My phone buzzed again, then finally a call came through. I picked it up this time, not because I wanted to hear his voice, but because I wanted it to stop. What? I said, my voice quieter than before. Not sharp, not defensive, just distant. Where did you go? Daniel asked immediately, his tone tight, controlled but strained underneath. You left early. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the question sit there. I came home, I said. Sophia, do not do this. He replied quickly. We can work this out. I almost asked him what exactly he thought needed to be worked out, but I already knew the answer. His version of fixing things meant returning everything to the way it was, to a version of me that fit neatly into the space they had created. You already made your decision, I said instead, keeping my voice even. This is just the part where I accept it. There was a pause on the other end, longer this time, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. Softer, uncertain. That is not fair, he said. You are acting like I did something extreme. I let out a slow breath, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. You replaced me in my own work, I said, in front of people who used to come to me for answers. He exhaled sharply. It is not like that, he insisted. You are still part of the team. The same words, repeated, like saying them enough times would make them true. I did not respond right away. I just listened to the silence between us. The space where something used to exist. Something that had already been eroding long before today. I do not think you understand, I said finally. I am not part of anything there anymore. Another pause, then he said, quieter now. So what? You are just going to walk away. I opened my eyes, staring at the ceiling again. Yes, I said, simple, direct. I think I am. He did not respond immediately, and when he did, his voice carried something new. Not anger, not control, but something closer to confusion. After everything, he said, you are just going to leave. I sat up slowly, my hand resting on the edge of the couch, grounding myself in the present moment. No, I replied. I am leaving because of everything. The line went quiet, not disconnected, just still, like neither of us knew what came next. And maybe that was the truth. There was no next step that involved both of us. Not anymore. We will talk tomorrow, he said eventually, his voice pulling back into something more controlled, more familiar. We will figure it out. I did not argue, did not correct him. I just said, "Good night, Daniel," and ended the call before he could respond. The silence returned immediately. Heavier this time, more complete. I set the phone down and walked into the bedroom. The bed was neatly made. The way I had left it that morning, the way I always left it, small routines that gave structure to things that did not always feel stable. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around, at the dresser, the closet, the small details that had once felt like part of a shared life, and for the first time, they did not feel shared anymore. They just felt like things, objects in a space that no longer held the same meaning. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder, the one I had signed earlier that day. I opened it slowly, scanning the pages again. The offer was still there, unchanged, solid, real in a way nothing else felt at the moment. London, a different office, a different structure, a place where I would not have to shrink myself to fit. I ran my fingers lightly over the edge of the paper, not as a decision this time, but as a confirmation of something I had already chosen. My phone buzzed once more. A message. I glanced at the screen. It was from an unknown number. I hesitated for a second, then opened it. "Sophia, this is Richard, Daniel's father. Call me when you can." I stared at the message longer than necessary. His name there, separate from Daniel, separate from everything that had just happened. And something about it felt different, not urgent, not demanding, just deliberate. I did not reply immediately. I set the phone down and leaned back slightly, closing my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle again. But this time it felt different, not empty, not isolating, just still, like the kind of silence that comes before something shifts. Something not loud, not dramatic, but enough to change direction. And for the first time that day, I realized I was not waiting for something to be fixed anymore. I was waiting for what came next. I did not call Richard that night, not because I was avoiding him, but because I already knew that whatever he wanted to say belonged to a version of my life that was already closing, and I needed one more night to sit in the quiet and let that reality settle without anyone else's voice shaping it. I woke up early the next morning, before the sun had fully come up, the light outside still soft and gray, the kind of light that makes everything feel unfinished. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I did not really drink, my laptop open in front of me, the folder still resting beside it, exactly where I had left it. I opened my email and started responding, not to the messages from Daniel or the team, but to the ones that actually mattered. Confirmations, timelines, logistics for the transition that had already been approved. "We will need your arrival date confirmed by Friday." One message read. I typed back without hesitation. "I will be there within 2 weeks." I paused for a second before hitting send, not because I was unsure, but because I understood what that sentence meant. Then I pressed the key, and just like that, something shifted from possibility into action. My phone buzzed again. "Daniel." I let it ring. Then another message appeared. "We need to talk before you make any decisions." I stared at the screen for a second, then typed back, "I already have," and set the phone down without waiting for a response. The rest of the morning moved quickly. I pulled a suitcase out from the closet, set it on the bed, and started packing. Not everything, Just what I needed. Clothes, documents, a few personal items that actually meant something to me. I moved through the apartment with a kind of quiet efficiency, not rushing, not hesitating, just doing what needed to be done. At one point, I stopped in the doorway of the living room, looking at the space, the couch, the lamp, the small details that had once felt like part of a shared life, and for a moment I wondered if I should feel something more, something heavier. But what I felt instead was clarity, clean and steady, like a line had been drawn, and I was finally standing on the other side of it. My phone buzzed again, this time a voicemail from Richard. I listened to it while folding a shirt, his voice calm, measured. "Sophia, I would like to understand what is happening," he said. "Call me when you are ready." I set the phone down without replying. Not yet, because I knew that conversation would come, but it would come on my terms, not in the middle of everything else. By mid-morning, I was back at my laptop, reviewing documents for the London role, systems, projections, early-stage plans that needed structure. I read through them carefully, making notes, identifying gaps, small adjustments that would make things run more efficiently. It felt familiar in the best way, not because it was easy, but because it required all of me, not just the version of me that had been reduced to support. I picked up my phone and dialed the number at the bottom of one of the emails. It rang twice before someone answered. "International Operations, this is Claire." Her voice was clear, direct. "Hi, this is Sophia Bennett," I said. "I am calling about the London transition." There was a brief pause, then a shift in her tone. "Of course, we have been expecting your call," she said. "When can you start?" I looked at the calendar on my screen, then at the suitcase on the bed. 2 weeks, I replied. "That works," she said. "We will send over the final details today." The conversation was short, efficient, exactly what it needed to be. When I ended the call, I sat there for a moment, letting the quiet settle again. But this time it felt different. Not empty, not isolating, just open, like space that had not been filled yet. My phone buzzed again. A message from Daniel, longer this time. I opened it. "You are overreacting, Sophia. This is not worth throwing everything away." I read it once, then again, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted to see if there was anything in it that felt real, anything that acknowledged what had actually happened. There was not. I typed a response, then deleted it, typed again, then stopped, because I realized something simple and clear. I did not need to explain this to him. Not anymore. I set the phone down without replying. The rest of the day moved forward, in small, deliberate steps, emails sent, calls made, arrangements confirmed, each action building something new, something separate from everything I was leaving behind. And with each step, the distance between who I had been in that house, at that table, in that office, and who I was becoming now, grew just a little bit wider. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to notice, enough to feel. By the time the sun started to set, the apartment looked different. Not empty, just lighter. Like it had already begun to let go of something it no longer needed to hold. I stood by the window, looking out at the city, the lights coming on one by one, and for the first time in a long time, I was not waiting for someone else to decide where I belonged. I was already moving toward it, and somewhere between the calls, the packing, the quiet decisions made without anyone else's approval, I realized something that felt both unfamiliar and certain. I was not rebuilding my life. I was finally building it the way it should have been from the start. And what none of them understood yet, what Daniel, Lila, even Richard had not fully realized, was that the systems I built do not just disappear when I leave. They shift, they adapt, and soon enough, they would start to feel the difference. London did not feel like a fresh start at first. It felt like stepping into something already moving, something that expected you to keep up without hesitation. The air was colder than I anticipated, sharper in a way that made every breath feel deliberate, and the building itself, glass and steel rising above a crowded street, reflected a version of me I had not fully stepped into yet. I stood in the lobby that first morning, a structured navy coat over a simple blouse, my badge clipped neatly at my side, the letters clear, Sophia Bennett, Director of International Operations. I read it once, not because I did not believe it, but because I needed to see it in that space, attached to me, not reduced, not adjusted, just stated. "Miss Bennett," a voice called from across the lobby. I turned slightly. A woman in her early 40s approached with a confident stride, tablet in hand. "Claire Morgan," she said, extending her hand. "Welcome to London." I shook her hand firmly. "Thank you," I replied, matching her tone, steady, direct. "We have a full schedule for you today," she continued, already turning toward the elevators, expecting me to follow, and I did, not hesitating, not slowing down, just stepping into the rhythm of something that did not require me to shrink to fit it. The elevator doors closed, the quiet hum of movement filling the space between us. "You will be leading the restructuring of 3 regional systems," Claire said, tapping her screen. "There have been inefficiencies. Inefficiencies, the word felt familiar, but here it was not being used to reduce me. It was being handed to me to solve. "Show me," I said simply, and she glanced at me briefly. A small nod of acknowledgement, not approval, not skepticism, just recognition, the kind that comes from someone who expects you to understand what you are doing. By the time we reached the 38th floor, I was already reviewing the data she had pulled up, numbers, patterns, small inconsistencies that pointed to larger structural issues. It felt like stepping into a language I already spoke, one I had been translating for others for years, now finally applied without interruption, without correction, without someone else claiming the narrative. "These timelines do not align," I said, pointing to a section on her screen. "There is a lag between regional reporting and central processing." Claire stopped walking, turning slightly to look at the data more closely. "We noticed that," she said, "but we have not identified the cause." I adjusted the tablet in my hands, scanning further. "It is not the reporting," I replied. "It is the integration protocol. It is duplicating data before validation." She looked at me again, this time longer, more focused. "How long would it take to fix?" she asked. "Direct? No hesitation." I handed the tablet back to her. 48 hours to correct the system, 1 week to stabilize it," I said. "If we start now." There was a brief pause, then she nodded once, decisive. "Then we start now." And just like that, there was no meeting to justify my role, no explanation required, just action. We moved quickly from one department to another, introductions made without unnecessary detail. "This is Sophia Bennett. She will be leading the restructuring," Claire would say, and that was enough. No one asked what I actually did. No one reduced it to something smaller. The title spoke for itself, and more importantly, so did the work. By midday, I was standing in a conference room with a group of managers, the screen behind me displaying a system map I had already begun to adjust. "We are not changing your output," I said, my voice clear, steady. "We are changing how it flows." One of the managers, a man in his 50s with a measured tone, raised a question. "And how do we know this will not disrupt current operations?" I met his gaze directly. "Because I have already run the model," I replied, "and the disruption you are concerned about is already happening. You just have not seen it yet." The room went quiet for a second, not tense, just attentive. I tapped the screen, highlighting a section of data. "This is where you are losing time," I said, "and this is how we fix it." I walked them through the process step by step, not rushing, not over-explaining, just presenting what was already clear to me, and by the end of the session, the tone in the room had shifted, not dramatically, but enough. Questions became more precise, more engaged, less about whether it would work, and more about how quickly they could implement it. "When do we start?" the same manager asked, and I allowed a small pause before answering, not for effect, just to let the moment settle. "We already have," I said, and that was the truth. By the time I left the building that evening, the system was already adjusting, small changes beginning to ripple through processes that had been stagnant for months. I stepped outside, the city moving around me in a steady rhythm. Taxis passing, people walking with purpose. And for the first time in a long time, I felt fully present in the space I occupied, not waiting, not adjusting, just there. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled it out, the screen lighting up with a name I had not seen in hours. Daniel. I stared at it for a second, then locked the screen without answering, sliding the phone back into my pocket, because at that moment, standing on a street in a city that did not know me yet but already recognized what I could do, I understood something clearly. The version of me that had sat at that table, being asked to apologize for something that was never mine to fix, was no longer the one making decisions. And as I started walking, the memory of that night came back, not as something heavy, not as something that held me in place, but as a point in time, a moment that connected directly to where I was now. And for the first time, I was not looking back at it with confusion or doubt. I was looking at it with clarity, because now I knew exactly what I had walked away from and exactly what I had stepped into. The message from Richard stayed unanswered, longer than I expected, not because I did not know what to say, but because I knew that once I stepped back into that conversation, even briefly, it would pull everything into the same space again, the same gravity I had just stepped away from. But some things do not stay paused forever. And 3 weeks later, standing in the lobby of a private hospital just outside Boston, I realized that distance does not erase connections. It just changes how they feel when they come back. The air inside was sterile, quiet in a way that felt controlled, like every sound had been measured before it was allowed to exist. I stood near the reception desk, my coat folded over my arm, my badge tucked into my bag, not because I was hiding it, but because this was not the place for it. This was not London, not the office, not a system I could adjust or stabilize. This was something else entirely. Sophia? A voice called from behind me. I turned slowly. Richard Bennett stood a few feet away, his posture straight as always, but there was something different in his expression, something less certain, less controlled. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice lower than I remembered. I nodded once, keeping my distance. "You said it was important," I replied. He glanced briefly toward the hallway behind him, then back at me. "It is," he said. "Daniel is upstairs." I did not react to the name, not outwardly, just a small shift in my focus. "And Lila," he added, as if clarifying the situation. I let the silence sit between us for a moment before speaking. "What happened?" I asked. Direct, because there was no reason to move around it. Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for just a second before returning to mine. "There have been complications," he said, choosing his words carefully. Like each one needed to be placed correctly. In the company, I felt something settle in my chest. Not surprise, not satisfaction, just recognition. "Complications," I repeated. He nodded. "Systems are failing," he said. "Reports are delayed. Contracts are not aligning. We are losing time. And in our industry, time is money." I listened without interrupting, letting him explain it in his own terms, even though I already understood what he was describing. "And you think I can fix it?" I said. He hesitated for a moment, just long enough to confirm that this was not just about the systems. "I think you understand it better than anyone else," he replied, honest in a way that felt unfamiliar coming from him. I adjusted the sleeve of my coat slightly, a small movement to ground myself. "You replaced me," I said, not as an accusation, just as a fact. Richard nodded once, slowly. "That decision was not mine," he said, and I believed him, not because it excused anything, but because it aligned with everything I had already seen. "But you allowed it," I replied. And this time, he did not answer immediately. The silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable, just real. "Come upstairs," he said eventually. "We should talk where they are." I looked past him toward the hallway. The quiet movement of nurses, the distant sound of a monitor, something steady and repetitive. I could feel the shift in the moment, the pull of something unresolved, something waiting. "I am not here to return," I said, my voice calm, controlled. "I am here to understand." Richard nodded again, accepting that boundary without argument. "That is all I am asking," he said. We walked down the hallway together, our footsteps muted against the polished floor, passing doors with small windows, glimpses of rooms where people existed in moments that had nothing to do with us. And yet somehow, everything felt connected, because this was where it had led. Not just the decisions at the office, not just the dinner, but everything before that. The patterns, the assumptions, the quiet shifts that had been ignored until they could not be anymore. Richard stopped in front of a door, his hand resting lightly on the handle. "Before we go in," he said, turning slightly toward me, "there is something you need to know." I met his gaze, steady, waiting. He hesitated, just for a second, then said, "The changes that were made, the systems that were adjusted, They were not fully understood. I almost smiled at that, not out of humor, but out of clarity. They were never meant to be, I replied, his expression shifted slightly, as if that answer confirmed something he had already suspected. And the papers? He added, his voice lowering, more careful now. The ones you sent. I felt the moment tighten, not externally, but internally, like something aligning exactly where it was meant to. I did not respond right away. I just let the silence hold, because I knew that once it was said, once it was acknowledged, there would be no going back to the version of events they had been holding on to. Richard watched me closely, waiting, and I could see it in his expression now, the realization that he did not have all the information, that there was something else beneath what they thought they understood, something that had already been set in motion long before any of them realized it. I reached for the door handle, my fingers resting lightly against it, feeling the cool metal under my skin, and for a brief second, everything slowed. The hallway, the quiet, the weight of what was about to be said, because inside that room, the version of me they thought they knew was still waiting, still expected to respond the same way, still expected to adjust, to explain, to fix what they had broken, but that version was already gone, and as I turned the handle slowly, I realized something else. They were not ready for what was actually coming next. The door opened quietly, no dramatic shift, no sudden movement, just the soft click of a handle turning and a room that looked almost exactly the way I expected it to, controlled, contained, like everything else in their world. Daniel was sitting by the window, his posture slightly forward, elbows resting on his knees, his phone in his hand but not in use, like he had been staring at it without seeing anything for a while. Lila stood near the far side of the room, arms crossed loosely, her expression composed but tighter than usual, and for the first time since I had known her, she did not look entirely certain of her position. Daniel looked up first, his eyes landing on me and staying there a second longer than necessary, as if he was trying to reconcile something that no longer aligned with what he expected. "You came," he said, his voice lower, less controlled than usual. I stepped inside without responding to that, closing the door gently behind me, the quiet of the room settling around us. "Your father said it was important," I replied, keeping my tone even, neutral, not cold, just clear. Lila shifted slightly, uncrossing her arms. "We need to talk about what you did," she said, her voice steady but edged with something I recognized, uncertainty masked as control. I glanced at her briefly, then back at Daniel. "Which part?" I asked. Daniel stood up slowly, placing his phone on the table beside him. "The papers," he said, more directly this time. "The ones you sent," there it was, no longer hinted at, no longer avoided, just placed in the room between us. I took a step further in, my hands resting lightly at my sides, grounded, steady. "You are going to have to be more specific," I said, not as a challenge, but as a refusal to accept the version of the story they were still holding on to. Daniel let out a short breath, frustration flickering across his face. "Do not do that," he said. "Do not act like you do not know what we are talking about." I held his gaze, calm, unshaken. "I know exactly what I sent," I replied. "I am asking what you think I sent." The silence that followed was not loud, but it was heavy, because in that moment, the difference between those two things started to become clear. Lila stepped forward slightly, her voice sharper now. "You submitted documentation that triggered a review," she said. "Financial, operational, compliance, all of it." I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without reacting to the tone. "Yes," I said, "that is correct." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, the movement quick, unsteady. "Do you have any idea what that is doing to the company right now?" he asked, his voice rising slightly, not loud but no longer controlled. I did not respond immediately. I let the question sit there, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted him to hear it in the space he had created. Then I said, "Yes," simple, direct, "I do." Lila let out a small, disbelieving breath. "Then why would you do that?" she asked, her composure slipping just enough to show what was underneath. I looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, and saw something I had not seen before. Not confidence, not control, but a gap, a space where understanding should have been, because the systems you took over were never designed to function without context, I said, my voice steady, measured. "And you removed the context." Daniel frowned slightly, confusion mixing with frustration. "What does that even mean?" he asked. I shifted my weight slightly, not stepping back, not moving forward, just holding my position. "It means," I said, "that the processes you thought were simple were layered, interconnected, and dependent on variables that were never documented because they required judgment, not repetition." The room went quiet again, but this time it was different. Not just tension, but realization starting to form. Slowly, unevenly, Lila shook her head slightly. "That does not justify triggering a full review," she said. "You could have explained this." I almost smiled at that, not out of humor, but because of how predictable it sounded. "I did explain," I replied. "For 3 years," Daniel's expression shifted again, something sharper now. "You are saying this is our fault," he said. And there it was, the need to reframe, to reposition responsibility. I met his gaze without hesitation. "I am saying this is the result," I answered, "of decisions that were made without understanding what they affected." Richard, who had remained near the door, silent until now, stepped slightly closer, his voice calm but firm. "And the papers," he said, "what exactly did you submit?" I turned my attention to him, the question direct, finally grounded in something real. "A full operational audit request," I said, "with supporting documentation." Daniel's face went still. Not shocked, not yet, just blank. Like his mind had not caught up to the words. Lila spoke first, her voice lower now. "That is not something you can just file on your own," she said. I held her gaze steady. "It is," I replied. "If you are the one who built the system being audited." The silence that followed was different from anything before. Not just tension, not just confusion, but something deeper, something that shifted the entire structure of the room. Daniel's eyes flicked to his father, then back to me. "You are saying," he began, his voice slower now, more careful, "that you had the authority to do this?" I did not raise my voice, did not change my tone. I just said it, clearly. "I am saying that I was the system," and that was the moment everything broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone, because the version of me they had been operating around, the one they thought they understood, the one they replaced, reduced, and dismissed, no longer existed in the way they needed it to. And now, standing in that room, they were finally seeing what had been there the entire time, just too quiet for them to notice. And the realization of that hit harder than anything I could have said. The silence after my words did not break immediately. It stretched, thin and fragile, like something no one wanted to touch first because they already understood it would not hold once it did. Daniel was the one who moved first. Not forward, not closer, just a small shift of his weight, like his body needed to adjust to something his mind had not fully accepted yet. "You are exaggerating," he said, but the confidence was gone from his voice, replaced by something quieter, something uncertain. I did not respond right away. I just watched him, the way his shoulders had tightened, the way his eyes kept moving between me and his father, looking for something solid to hold on to. "I am not," I said finally, my tone unchanged, steady, because there was no need to push harder. The truth had already done that on its own. Lila stepped back slightly, her arms no longer crossed, her posture no longer composed. "If that were true," she said, her voice controlled but thinner now, "then none of this would have happened without you approving it." I looked at her for a moment, letting her words settle. Then I replied, "Exactly." And that was the part they had not considered. Not fully, not until now. Because approval does not always look like a signature. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like someone trusting that the structure they built will not be dismantled without understanding what holds it together. Richard spoke next, his voice lower, more measured than before. "Then why did you not stop it?" he asked. Not accusing, just asking. And that question mattered more than anything Daniel or Lila had said, because it was the only one that came from a place of trying to understand instead of defend. I shifted my attention to him, meeting his gaze directly. "Because I was not asked," I said, "and I am not responsible for correcting decisions I was excluded from." Daniel let out a short breath, frustration returning in small pieces. "You could have said something," he insisted. "You could have told me." I held his gaze, calm, unshaken. "I did," I replied. "You just did not listen." The room went quiet again. But this time it was different. Not tense, not uncertain, just still. Like everything had settled into place whether they were ready for it or not. Lila looked down briefly, then back up, her expression sharper now, defensive in a different way. "So what now?" she asked. "You just let everything fall apart?" I almost smiled, not because it was amusing, but because of how narrow that perspective was. "I am not letting anything fall apart," I said. "I stepped away from something that was already unstable." Daniel shook his head slightly, pacing once across the small space before stopping again. "This is not how things work," he said, his voice rising just enough to show that he was losing control of the narrative. "You do not just walk away and expect everything to collapse." I watched him for a moment, then said quietly, "No, Daniel, you expect it to continue because you never understood how it was held together." The words landed differently this time. Not sharp, not aggressive, just final. Richard exhaled slowly, running a hand along his jaw as he processed everything that had been said. "The audit," he said, more to himself than to me. "It will not stop quickly." I nodded once, acknowledging what he already knew. "It was not designed to," I replied. He looked at me again, more directly now. "And you are not coming back to fix it." It was not a question, just a statement. I did not hesitate. "No," I said, simple. "Clear?" Daniel stopped pacing, turning toward me fully. "So that is it," he said. "You just leave everything behind." I held his gaze, not reacting to the words, because they were not accurate, not anymore. "I left what was never mine to carry alone," I answered, and that was the difference he still could not see. The shift from obligation to choice, from being expected to hold everything together to deciding where my responsibility actually ended. Lila let out a quiet breath, her composure slipping just enough to show what was underneath. "This is going to cost the company millions," she said, and there was something in her tone now that had not been there before. Not confidence, not control, but concern, real and unfiltered. I nodded slightly, not dismissing it, just acknowledging the reality of it. "Yes," I said, "it probably will." Daniel stared at me for a moment longer, like he was trying to find something familiar in my expression, something he recognized, but there was nothing there for him to hold on to anymore. "I do not recognize you," he said finally, his voice quieter now, almost uncertain. I did not respond right away. I let the words sit between us, because they were not entirely wrong, not from his perspective. "That is because you never actually knew me," I said, not unkindly, not with anger, just truth, the kind that does not need to be forced. Richard stepped back slightly, creating space in the room without saying anything, his silence carrying more weight now than before, as if he understood that whatever needed to be said had already been said, and what remained was not resolution, not yet, but something closer to consequence, something that would continue long after this moment ended. I adjusted my coat slightly, a small, grounding movement, then looked at each of them once, not searching for a reaction, not waiting for a response, just seeing them clearly for what they were in this moment. Daniel, unsettled, trying to rebuild control. Lila, calculating, already thinking about what came next. Richard, quiet, processing the full scope of what had been set in motion. "I did not come here to argue," I said, my voice steady. "I came to make sure you understood." Daniel opened his mouth slightly, as if he wanted to respond, but then stopped, because there was nothing left that would change what had already shifted. And that was the part none of us could undo. Not him, not me, not any of them. I turned toward the door, my hand resting lightly on the handle, the same position I had been in before, but this time it felt different, not uncertain, not suspended, just complete. And even as I stepped out into the hallway again, the quiet settling around me once more, I could feel it, the tension still there, unresolved, not finished, because some things do not end in a single moment. They unfold, slowly, in ways you cannot always see right away, and I knew this was not the end of it. Not for them, not for me, not yet. I did not go back into that room again after I stepped out, and strangely, I did not feel like I needed to, because whatever needed to be said had already been said, not in a way that demanded applause or closure, but in a way that finally aligned with something inside me that had been quiet for far too long. The weeks that followed did not unfold dramatically. There were no sudden collapses or loud consequences that played out in front of me. Instead, everything moved the way real things do, slowly, with emails that grew shorter, calls that came less frequently, and updates that reached me secondhand, filtered through people who still thought I might step back in and fix what had already been set in motion. But I did not. I stayed in London, in that office where my name was not followed by a question, where my decisions did not need to be softened to be accepted, where I could walk into a room and be understood without explanation. And it was not perfect. It was still work, still pressure, still long days, where nothing felt easy. But it was mine in a way nothing had been before. I remember one evening in particular, standing alone in the conference room, long after everyone else had left, the city lights reflecting off the glass walls, my reflection faint but steady, and on the table in front of me was my badge, the same one I had clipped on that first morning, the letters still clear, unchanged. I picked it up, turning it over slowly in my hand, and for a moment I thought about all the versions of myself that had existed before this one, the girl in the kitchen holding a certificate no one asked about, the woman at a dinner table being told to apologize for something that was never hers to carry, the version of me that stayed quiet because it felt easier than being seen. And I realized something simple but undeniable. None of those versions were wrong. They were just incomplete. They were pieces of something that had not yet fully understood its own value. And it took losing everything that felt familiar to finally see what had been there all along. I did eventually speak to Richard again, not in that hospital, but later, over a call that lasted less than 10 minutes. He did not ask me to come back. He did not try to convince me to change anything. He just said, "I see it now," and I believed him, not because it fixed anything, but because it meant something had shifted on his side too. Daniel did not call again after that day, not in the way he used to, not with the expectation that I would answer, and Lila, from what I heard, stayed, tried to stabilize what she had stepped into. But systems built without understanding do not fail loudly. They just stop holding, piece by piece, until what remains cannot support what it once did. And that is not revenge. It is just reality, the kind that does not need to be forced. It simply unfolds, and in all of that, in the distance, in the silence, in the space that used to feel like loss, I found something I had not known I was missing: clarity, not the kind that comes all at once, but the kind that builds slowly, with each decision you make for yourself, instead of for someone else. I learned that boundaries are not something you explain to be understood. They are something you live, consistently, even when it makes other people uncomfortable. I learned that respect is not something you ask for. It is something that becomes non-negotiable the moment you decide your value is not dependent on someone else recognizing it. And maybe the hardest lesson of all, I learned that love, real love, does not ask you to become smaller to make it work. It does not require you to disappear so someone else can feel whole. If you are listening to this and something in this story feels familiar, if you have ever sat in a room where your voice felt optional, where your presence felt conditional, I want you to know this. You are not difficult for wanting to be seen. You are not wrong for recognizing when something is no longer aligned with who you are becoming. And you are not required to stay in a place that only values the version of you that is easiest to overlook. Protect your work, protect your time, protect your sense of self, even when it feels uncomfortable, especially when it does. Because your intuition, that quiet voice that speaks before everything else gets loud, it is there for a reason. Call it instinct, call it faith, call it the way God or the universe nudges you towards something better, but do not ignore it. It knows when something is off long before your mind is ready to accept it. Thank you for staying with me through this story, for listening, for holding space for something that is not always easy to say out loud, because sometimes the most important part of healing is simply knowing that someone else understands what you felt, even if they were not there when it happened. My name is Sophia Bennett. I am 32 years old, and the lesson I want to leave you with is this. You do not have to fight to be valued. You just have to stop staying where you are not. And if this story meant something to you, you can share your thoughts below. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is where you are, because those small connections matter more than we realize. And if you are not ready to speak yet, that is okay too. Just know you are not alone in what you are feeling. There are more stories like this waiting for you, stories that remind you of your strength, your clarity, your ability to choose differently, and if you feel ready, you can continue with the next one. Sometimes the story you need to hear next is already waiting for you to press play.